In this video, we're going to continue on with the build of our 7-inch Freestyle quad. And if you take a look at the picture here, you'll see that there's already a little bit of an issue with this video in that it's got the parts that we were going to be doing in this video already completed. Basically what happened was I'd filmed the whole thing, and when I went to start doing the editing on my computer, I found that some of the footage had been deleted accidentally, and some other parts of the footage were so off-center and missing out that it was just terrible. Instead, what we will do is simply go through the steps that you would need to take in order to attach all of these things and go through some of the things to look out for and pay attention to. If you are new to this and are feeling a little bit unsure about the whole process of doing the soldering, I'll put a little video component at the very end to explain how to do the soldering. And just some of the things to pay attention to when you're doing that. Let's jump into this by first taking a look at some of the tools and parts that you're going to need in order to do this process. You will need some kind of wire nippers or cutters like this so you can trim wires to the proper sizes that you need them. You will very much want to have some pair of tweezers like this that are self-closing, where you squeeze them and then they shut for themselves and hold things. These are very, very useful for this process. You will want to have a smoke stopper of some kind so you can test all of the connections as you're going through to make sure that you're not having any shorts and that nothing is going to burn up in the electronics. I would highly recommend some double-sided tape like this. Very useful for holding things in place. Zip ties of one size, shape, or another will be handy. And I just know this as Emax tape. It's kind of an acetate tape of some kind. It's very, very durable and very flexible and works very well for just wrapping things down. Of course, you will also need the various components that you're going to be putting in, and that's what we're going to talk about next. I've installed a GPS unit on the back of this quadcopter. So to connect this, what you're going to end up doing is soldering the 4 wires for the GPS unit to the GPS. There's a ground, there is a power which runs at 4.5 volts, and there is a UART transmit and a UART receive pad on the GPS. Before you go and start to solder them onto the flight controller board, make sure that you route the wires through where they need to go. It's a very disappointing thing to be working on your parts, solder it here, and then realize that you have to try to feed it through a hole that it doesn't fit through anymore. So attach to the one end, route the wires through where you think they need to go. When you get to the appropriate place, which is in this case the GPS is coming up to here, measure your wires to an appropriate length plus a little bit extra so that you have some flex in them so that they aren't just being pulled tight all of the time. With the GPS unit, we want it to be able to activate once we give the flight controller power from the USB port. And so the way we solder this on is we've got a ground and the 4.5 volt. So we want to use that one for a 4.5 volt. And so we run that wire up, and you can see here it's connected to the 4.5 volt and it's connected to the ground. And then here we have the T on the UART from the flight controller connects to the receive on the GPS unit, and the receive on the flight controller connects to the transmit over here on the GPS unit. That is all that you will need to do. Just make sure that you have run your wires where they need to be before you do the final soldering. The next item that we would install is the video transmitter. We have to be a little careful with wiring the video transmitter, and we have to pay attention to the voltage rating of the video transmitter that we're using. Many video transmitters will take full battery voltage all the way up to 6S voltage, in which case you basically could use any pad for powering the video transmitter. However, this particular SpeedyB video transmitter has a maximum voltage rating of 5 volts, which means it has to be connected to a 5-volt pad or we'll burn it out. And so what we have done here is we've run the 5 volts straight from the pad here. We have a ground for it right beside. And then from here on the video transmitter, you can see there's a yellow wire, which is the video, and a green one, which is going to be for the smart audio. And if we follow them up, we can see right here, there is a pad that's called the VTX, and that is where the video from the video transmitter will go. And then the smart audio or IRC tramp needs to connect to a UART. And you can see right up here, if we follow it up, it's a little hidden underneath there. If I can separate these wires here, but you can see that it is connected to pad T1, which is the UART, the transmit UART for UART number 1. The next item we have here is the receiver. And the receiver is based on two-way UART communication, and so we need to connect it to a complete UART of its own. Typically, not always, but very typically, receivers are set up on UART number 2. And if we take a look up here, we can see that there is a T2 and an R2, which would be for UART 2. And then we have here a 4V5 pin, which is 4.5 volts, which means the receiver gets power from USB. And we have the ground, and they're all just right together. I have happened to set my receiver here closer to the back, and that's because where my GPS is connected also happens to have a place to mount the receiver's antenna. You do not need to do it this way. That just happens to be comfortable for my particular build. So in my case, what I did is I took some double-sided tape, put it underneath the receiver, and ran the wires through underneath to the front of the flight controller. And again, attach the wires to the one end first, run them through where you believe they're going to need to be going comfortably. So here's my receiver. I know that I'm going to be running them up and through. So I got all the wires up and through, got them over, cut them a little bit longer than they needed to be to ensure there's some slack, and then got them ready and soldered them on. The next item that we can see that's kind of a major thing is the FPV camera up here in the front. Cameras like this typically have 3 wires that they need. They need a power, they need a ground, and they need a signal wire for the video to be transferred. Now they will also sometimes have other wires. For example, this one here has an additional 2 which I've folded under and hidden away that allow it to be connected to a camera control to adjust settings inside the camera. The camera that you have should have come with a plug in it that has its wires already attached. So what you'll need to do is mount the camera, run the wires where you think that they're going to be, sort of tape them down, hold them down in place, and then trim them off with a little bit extra so that there's the slack. On this particular flight control board, you can see that at the front of it here, there's a very convenient place for us to have a 5-volt for the camera, a ground to ground it out, and the camera, which is the video feed for the camera coming in. That's where you would solder in your analog FPV camera. If you're running DJI or a digital system, the setup's a little bit different. There is one more component on here, and that's this right here, which is a lost model beeper. This has its own little power source. It's got a LiPo battery underneath it, which means that this kind will have 3 wires coming off it. It's going to have a ground, a power, and then essentially a signal wire, which will turn the buzzer on and off when you want it to be. Again, just for the convenience of being able to put it someplace where I could access it and push the button easily, I've mounted this on the front of the quadcopter. And then I've simply run the wires back and through, holding them down with a zip tie. On this particular flight control board, the place for soldering and the buzzer that's already been defined is at the back of the board. And you can see here, there's a 5-volt, there's a buzzer plus and a buzzer minus, and that's where the buzzer would get soldered on. Beyond that, all you need to do is simply make sure that everything is secured snugly by using pieces of double-sided tape and the zip ties like this to hold it in place, like I did here with the buzzer. Try as much as you can to keep the wires as short as possible, but always with some slack. You don't want the wires flapping around like this when you're flying, but you also don't want them to be stretched tight like a rubber band, because they'll break just as easily that way too. So I think that basically should take you through the steps of where you need to connect your different parts and how you need to do it. For those of you who have not done much soldering before, we'll take a step over and we'll switch into a quick how to solder tutorial for little parts and flight controllers like this. So the thing to remember here when you're doing this is simply try to make sure that the tools you're using are appropriate for the size of the job that you're trying to do. What I typically use when I'm working on soldering pads that are very small, like you would find on a flight control board like this, is I like to use a very fine tip, which allows you to have a fairly fine control over placement of the heat. And that's what you really want to be able to do. You want to be able to direct the heat exactly where you want it and no place else. If the tip that you have is simply too large, look at ways of maybe modifying it. In the past, I simply made myself a secondary tip like this, which is just some, I remember that is 14 gauge solid core copper wire that I took and wrapped around the tip like this, so that when it's on there, I had a much finer tip and it took the heat and I could solder like that. And that's going to be the same thing with the solder. You want to use a fine solder for this. Just as an example, here is some more electronic solder, but it's a much heavier gauge. This is 20 gauge. And if you see, just when you hold it up to the pad, the solder itself is basically the same size as the pad. And so even if you melt just a tiny bit, it's going to completely saturate it much faster than you need. Having a solder that is a much more appropriate size, you can see, will be way simpler and easier to manage. What I typically use is 23 gauge rosin core solder. Also, having a flux pen like this makes this process, especially with these tiny wires, so much easier. So really good idea to have one. A couple other things that will be very helpful going through this can be helping hand like this, so you can hold wires if you're going to need to tin them. So what you can also use for this is just a piece of blue tack or sticky tack, which you use to hold things on the wall. And you just basically put it there and you can squeeze the wire on it like that and it will stay in place and you can do the soldering on it without any real difficulty. Let's get into the process here of doing this. What we're going to do first is take a look at preparing some of the pads on here. Now this is just a basic tutorial. It's how you would do it for any of the pads that we were talking about earlier in this video about, soldering on the GPS unit or the buzzer or whatever it is. The process for doing that is exactly the same. So don't worry about which pads here I'm specifically working on. This is just the basic how to do it. And the first thing that I'm going to do here is tin the pads here. So I'll be working on these pads here. So I'll just take the flux pen, just put just a touch on each one. It doesn't take very much at all, just a little drop on there. I've got my soldering iron here set to 750 degrees Fahrenheit. The reason I like it at 750 is it's a heat that's very controllable by changing the tip size on your soldering iron. By having a much finer tip on it, even though it's hot, it can't push through as much heat as a very heavy tip would be able to do. And so for small size pads like this, at 750 degrees, it works just fine. So I have put the flux on those particular pads. So all I'm going to do now is just come in and heat it up. You know what? I'm going to do something here. I'm going to put this right onto the blue tack so it doesn't move around. So I'm going to take this pad here. I'm just going to heat it up. See, there's no solder anywhere near that yet. I'm going to come down and heat the pad. It's taking its time. It's not a race here. There we are. Just keep heating the pad, and then you apply the solder to the edge of the pad so it will start to flow in. So we'll take a look here at this 4v5 pad. So again, just heat the pad, and approach from the side, add the solder, and you can see it's got a blob on it now. And you can see also that there's very little solder on the actual iron itself. Okay, we'll go here to the ground pad. We'll try this again. Now a ground pad will typically require a little bit more heat than the other pads. It's not that you need to make it hotter, it just means you have to take a little more time. Once that pad goes, add the solder to the side of it, and it will go in. All right, so that's the basic idea of tinning onto the board. And so what we need to do is get the wire prepared itself. Now just to come back and take a look, here's a much larger wire that we are not going to use. And what we want to do when we're preparing the wires is, again, we need to make sure that everything is the right size for what we're trying to solder. So this wire is a good example of two problems. First of all, if I just line it up on a separate pad here, you can see that it's very big for that particular pad. But also, when we take a look, you can see that back part here, even when all of the wire is properly on that pad, there's still a fair bit of the wire exposed off of the board. And we don't really want that either. We want the exposed wire to be exactly the same size as that pad, maybe just a tiny little bit bigger, but that's it. And so if we take a look at one of these, which has already been pre-done, you can see that that part that's exposed on there is absolutely tiny. But when we hold it up to the pad, we can see that it's basically the right size for that pad, and it will fit just nicely. So what we will do is tin this to get it ready, and then we'll solder it on. Use just a tiny bit of flux on these. There we are. Get that in the way I can see. So again, I'll heat the wire first. And there you go. There's now a nice bit of solder on the tip of that wire. What we're going to do is simply attach the wire to the flight controller. And this is where using tweezers like this is super, super handy. You can just get in extremely close to the point that's being soldered in. You don't have to worry about your fingers at all. Get your soldering iron ready, you bring it in, you just lay the wire where it's going to be attached to the flight controller and allow the solder to melt and flow together. And that's it. What if you have a piece of wire like this that doesn't have the tip exposed on it? It can be pretty hard at times just to take off just like 1 millimeter and have only that much exposed. So what you can do is you can, and that's partly why we leave slack when we're measuring the wires, as I was talking about earlier, is so you can actually expose a very big piece like this, which is way more than you're going to need on the pad. That's ridiculous, right? That would be not safe. But what you do is tin that whole piece. And so now that that whole piece is tinned, and it's still much too long, what I can do is come in here and simply trim it off to a more appropriate length. I'm not sure why my one GoPro turned off, but it did. Too hot, it says. Thank you. That's pretty much the end of this. So the idea here is, with the soldering, make sure your parts are the right size, that you've got the small wires that you need for small pads like this, that you're using a smaller tip on your iron and smaller gauged solder. The flux pen will help a lot, and that's basically all you need to be able to do in order to do the soldering. So for each one of these parts that's on here, you simply need to do the same thing on the quadcopter. I hope this has been helpful until now. Until the next time, safe flying, and thank you very much for watching. Take care.